Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 16 of series 12. The question for the day is Richard Hare's prescriptivism made redundant by value theory ethics? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, chapter 4, section 2. My basic philosophical question is again, what can we do with human existence as consciousness? But invariably, this question is misunderstood due to a widespread lack of appreciation of consciousness. Yet I answer in terms of value, which itself can enhance an appreciation of consciousness. So my answer is in terms of value, the will to value leading to a certain independence or sufficiency of value. Yet because ethics is principally about values, I look to ethical theory to help me understand values. And in this search, I have developed what I call a value theory ethics. I outline this view later and argue for it in detail elsewhere. Yet here, I want to point out some similarities between value theory ethics and Richard Hare's prescriptivism. We have also looked at other theories of ethics, such as utilitarianism and Kantian ethics. Yet there are many other theories of ethics, like emotivism, expressivism, and contractualism, as well as virtue theory ethics, which can even act as an introduction to value theory ethics. This is because virtues are values that culminate in a comprehensive experience of life. And thinkers like Rawls, Parfit, and Dworkin also have their own theories of ethics. Yet today I want to look at prescriptivism, the ethical theory introduced by Richard Hare in 1952. Hare held that moral judgments, or the prescriptions of agents, have an authority that is similar to both emotivism and value theory ethics, in allowing agents to prescribe moral action. This is the key feature that I find shared by prescriptivism and value theory ethics. But the principles that guide their actions are different. That is, value theory ethics calls for the construction and the establishment of the best values that can be mustered, based on principles of value like the will to value and value sufficiency, whereas prescriptivism uses the linguistic and logical implications of words like ought and good to work out what actions are to be taken on both universal and utilitarian bases. So two key concepts here are subjectivity of choice in allowing agents to prescribe moral action, and universality of principle, which have different meanings for value theory ethics and prescriptivism. In prescriptivism, personal preferences must be universalized and applied to other people. Yet Hare carefully examines different ways in which personal preferences apply to others. The problem for Hare, as I see it, is in distinguishing a principle of moral good that can guide our preferences. That is, he calls for testing of preferences through reason, impartiality, empathy, and utilitarian outcomes. But these are conventions that don't provide a specific definition or guidance for the moral good. Yet this problem might be mitigated by interpreting Hare's methodological requirements. That is, in Hare's view, in order to be moral judgments at all, moral judgments must have three features of 1. Prescriptivity, or making moral prescriptions; 2. Overriding other judgments such as aesthetics; and 3. They must be universalizable and are thereby also applicable to other people. Yet these methodological requirements imply what is good about the moral good. But unlike prescriptivism, value theory ethics is equivocal about what ethics is, and about what is deemed to be a moral judgment and what is not. Because in my view, ethics is subject to varying criteria, and it isn't a definitive category. Yet value theory ethics nevertheless constrains moral judgments by principles of value, and those constraints are eventually inescapable and are universal in that qualified sense, so they are not immediately applicable to every agent. But the similarity is that Hare requires agents to work out what the material content of moral action should be. That is, he sets the formal content of moral action with a principle, but it is that of universalization, which for Hare presupposes certain moral values like justice, rights, and fairness, and these are implemented with reason, coherence, and a consideration of outcomes. That is, Hare uses universalizability and prescriptivity as criteria to determine the category of morals or ethics. But as above, this definition of ethics seems to influence the determination of what is the moral good. But a more pronounced difference between value theory ethics and prescriptivism is that whereas value theory ethics employs an emerging but inescapable principle of value to guide action, prescriptivism, like Kant, appeals to universalizability as a formal principle of ethics. And because Hare's morality is overriding, it can't genuinely compete with other values. Another comparison and contrast that can be made between value theory ethics and prescriptivism is that value theory ethics uses both intuitive thinking in locating values as well as the application of reason. Yet Hare's preference for critical and analytic thought, he also uses a two-tier, a two-level utilitarianism, that is, intuitive and universally accepted moral rules for efficiency in daily life, and critical thinking when intuition conflicts with those accepted moral rules. But as seen in Kant, there are a number of problems with the idea of universality as a moral principle. One of them is whether an external criterion like universality should be a moral principle at all, because it assumes priority over internal criteria like moral intent, disposition, and meaningfulness. Another problem of universality is that it presupposes moral values like justice, but cannot justify them. For example, one universal solution to suffering is to kill all living creatures, which is universal but unacceptable. And simply appealing to intuition or common sense steps outside the principle of universality. A third problem is how to precisely define what is to be taken as a universal edict. For example, a universal edict might be given as do not kill, but does this include killing in a just war, or to save your life, or killing a week-old fetus, or killing on the Sabbath or on Thursdays? That is, universals must take some particular form, but there's no definitive way to limit their qualifications. Fourthly, of course, Hare is advocating the universalization of a formal moral principle. To explain these terms, formal content is concerned with principles like do no harm or love all mankind. But material content is about the practical expression of such principles. We can note several examples of different interpretations of moral statements that are central to prescriptivism. For a moral realist, the statement murder is wrong is about the inherent wrong in the act of murder. Then for a moral relativist, this statement only means that murder is disapproved of by society. And according to emotivism, the statement only expresses an attitude of the speaker. But according to prescriptivism, the edict do not murder is expressing a statement of the speaker that is also an imperative that other people ought to adopt as a universal. But the speaker is then confronted with all the noted problems of universal edicts. The problem that I myself pose is that even a formal universal principle must accommodate different levels of awareness or degrees of consciousness. This is why any overriding principle must be emergent as well as normative. Another contrast with value theory ethics is prescriptivism's fidelity to the methods of analytic philosophy, together with its constraints of logical reason, language, and meaning. These logical and linguistic methods focus largely on the clarification of concepts and their logical relations. And Hare believes that an emphasis on method and meaning is needed in order to avoid problems in ethics. For example, he emphasizes the difference between a good picture and the moral meaning of good. A similar concern can be found in my distinction between material and human values. Hare also strongly endorses Hume's prohibition on deriving ought from is, and he not only follows More's anti-naturalism, but also argues against naturalism. Yet in analytic fashion, he goes further to maintain a strong distinction between facts and values. That is, many people like Hare and myself endorse Hume's substantial is-ought distinction, but Hare also endorses a strict fact-value distinction that others, like Putnam and myself, disagree with. This is because of an entanglement between facts and values seen in such as value-laden facts. Yet Hare's rationality shares another aspect of Kantian thinking, that moral commitments are overriding. That is, as rational justifications, they override other considerations of motivations of moral action. If they don't, something has gone wrong, such as a prescription hasn't been fully universalized, and hence not accepted by Hare as a distinctively moral prescription. Another aspect of these differences with value theory ethics is a mistrust of the method of analytic philosophy, which might be contrasted to, say, empiricism or a phenomenology of value. Yet this is too large an issue to be taken up here in its entirety. But one aspect of this issue is raised by the logical and linguistic methodology of analytic philosophy, that questions whether prescriptivism may be more of a neutral meta-ethics than an ethical theory. This is because although Hare presupposes certain moral values like justice, rights and fairness, his prescriptivism is largely about philosophical method of a particular kind. For example, prescriptivism can be non-committal on the question of whether murder is actually right or wrong. It is more interested in the conceptual analysis of moral concepts such as murder. Yet the ethically uncommitted character of prescriptivism, like analytic and linguistic philosophy, results in an openness about the determination by the agent of applied moral conduct. This is shared with value theory ethics, except for its formal moral principle of universalizability, which value theory ethics applies as an inescapable emergent principle. Yet another difference with value theory ethics can be found in the practices of linguistic philosophy. One criticism is that linguistic philosophy attempts to construe all philosophical questions in terms of language. This conveniently reduces philosophical problems to a form that can be more easily handled. But it has been accused of trivializing philosophy by evading central issues. One example of this approach is asking, what does the word murder mean, rather than is it right or wrong? But following this thinking, we can ask whether it's possible to ask whether murder is right or wrong, This is because wrongness is part of the meaning of murder that can't be divorced from it. So in this view, murder is always wrong, and the word murder really needs to be replaced by another, like killing. We would then have to ask, is it wrong to kill other people? Another example can be found in the question, is stealing wrong? But again, wrongness is part of the meaning of stealing and can't easily be taken out of the word. And the question would have to be rephrased as, is it wrong to take things that are not yours? But these aren't questions that prescriptivism typically asks or can answer. Yet they show the importance of analysing moral concepts in a correct way. But prescriptivism isn't just neutral analysis, but actually enters into the process of prescribing imperatives. This is a serious objection to a prescriptivist analysis, that moral judgments cannot entail imperatives. But the point here is that prescriptivity also holds that moral judgments bear upon our actions if we believe them. This raises the interesting idea that beliefs form part of the groundwork of our moral values. Yet these are rationalist and cognitivist ideas that will influence a conception of the good. And this rationalist influence will bear upon such concepts as fairness and equality. In addition to prescriptivism, what is called Hare's universal prescriptivism means that the command "do not murder" holds for everyone. That is, anyone making such a prescription should be equally willing to make it about anyone else. Hare thereby has similar views to Kant with respect to universality and prescriptivity. But Hare adds an analysis of language to Kant's ethics. That is, prescriptivism presents the view that the ordinary usage of moral language is prescriptive, and what pervades moral language are imperatives, not just indicative facts. An example of this, as well as the apparent ambivalence in prescriptivism, is found in an argument by John Searle. We have previously seen Searle's argument on how to derive an ought from an is. That is, speech acts make moral commitments based on promising with subsequent obligations. Yet Hare endorses Hume's principle with certain moral consequences, and Searle seems to present his argument only as an academic exercise. As above, Hare's prescriptivism is also described as universal prescriptivism, meaning applicable to everyone. This is an aspect of prescriptivism that has been compared to Kant's prioritization of universality. But Hare replaces Kant's imperative of must with an analysis of ought. That is, Hare's universal prescriptivism derives from linguistic and logical examination of the word ought, and moral statements are distinct from others as prescriptions about how we think things ought to be, as well as being distinct from other prescriptions due to their universalizability. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy thereby informs us that Hare's system was also able to accommodate a central part of the Kantian outlook, that is, universality, but that also Hare's theory preserved the important emotivist thesis that a person's moral commitments are not rationally challengeable for their content, but only for their coherence with that person's other moral commitments, unquote. The authority of moral choice is thereby partly shared with value theory ethics, except for certain internal constraints of structures of value. Yet we can also examine Hare's prescriptivism as a product of linguistic philosophy in the mid-20th century. The importance of language in philosophy can be partly explained by its necessity in any description. Some form of language is also essential to argument and logic. So language came to be seen as both necessary and universal. And in the mid-20th century linguistic turn, problems of philosophy were regarded as linguistic problems. Wittgenstein, for example, saw problems as confusions that needed to be dissolved rather than resolved, and questions of ethics, metaphysics, and mind were turned into questions about the meaning of statements, like as above, what does the word stealing mean, rather than what thoughts and actions does stealing involve. And the mental property of intentionality was redefined by Roderick Chisholm and others into the linguistic concept of intentionality, spelt with an S, as a that statement. This turned difficult problems into more manageable questions about language. But there were some challenges to this practice. John Mackey, for example, argued that a psychological state cannot necessarily be described through a linguistic description that is merely but possible a contingent state of affairs, that is language. Some thinkers nevertheless took this exclusivity of language even further. Anthony Kenny and William Neal held propositions to be essential to all mental life except bare sentience. This means that language is deemed an essential precondition to thinking and believing. Yet against this view, Noam Chomsky, John Searle, and others accept that thought can exist without language. And arguments for non-linguistic thought can also be drawn from animals and non-linguistic humans. But Kenny goes even further to claim that self-consciousness presupposes the possession of language. But existence of non-linguistic humans shows that self-consciousness does not presuppose language. And in my view, the linguistic turn has been a misleading detour for philosophy and Hare's ethics. Yet the heritage of linguistic philosophy has been a mixed advantage. Wittgenstein made great strides forward in the theory of language and meaning, as well as excesses. Yet Wittgenstein's philosophy of language is understood as having two versions, the earlier and the later. His earlier view was a picture theory of language that is only meaningful if pictured in the real world. This view assumes an unbridgeable gap between language and what is expressed non-verbally. So in Wittgenstein's early view, language had to function as a pictorial representation. But both versions attempted to resolve philosophical problems in terms of language. Upon writing this view in his Tractatus, he claimed to have solved all the problems of philosophy and thereby retired. But after the discussion with the Vienna Circle, he found he hadn't solved all the problems and returned to philosophy. Wittgenstein then developed his complex or use theory of language and meaning. He moved away from his early atomistic view with the single foundation that he inherited from Bertrand Russell. His later view involved many complex and overlapping practices that he called language games. That is, he described language as a form of life that represented the complex interrelations of life, and language is thereby presented as a means of understanding human life. But he paradoxically proclaimed ethics and ethical values beyond comprehension. Yet it's important to note a common feature of Wittgenstein's early and later philosophies of language. That is, again, in both views, he claimed that philosophical problems arise because we misunderstand language, and that they could be similarly resolved or dissolved, as he put it, by understanding language. What changed was Wittgenstein's conception of how language works. In the question of whether Hare's prescriptivism is an ethics or just a meta-ethics, or possibly both, we should consider his arguments against ethical naturalism and against moral facts, as well as his reliance on language, and his engaging in trivial questions like whether ought implies can, discussed shortly. Hare endorsed both Hume's is-ought. Hare endorsed both Hume's is-ought distinction and More's naturalistic fallacy, yet he had some qualifications and added arguments of his own. I have myself previously said that More presents rationalist and analytic arguments which may not be completely successful against naturalistic or synthetic claims. Yet, like More, Hare argued that good is not a natural property, like pleasurable, to be discovered, but he added that it is also a term to commend actions or choices, and that such moral terms have a prescriptive function or prescriptivity that calls for action. And naturalism fails because defining good as a natural property removes this prescriptive function inherent in moral language. Yet Hare goes further towards embracing the concept of value in arguing that naturalists cannot escape an evaluative element when defining good, even as a non-moral property. The idea of a good painting, for example, relies on subjective evaluative criteria such as quality rather than purely objective natural facts. This embrace of the idea of value, together with Hare's prescriptivity, as well as making such statements as, "It is no part of my purpose to reduce moral language to imperatives," unquote. This is because contingent linguistic imperatives cannot provide objective moral guidance. Yet it furthers the ambivalence between ethics and metaethics shared with value theory ethics. But Hare takes up another question of whether ought implies can that indicates a neutral perspective. This apparently anodyne question has been debated extensively in analytic philosophy in the past. Ought is often held to imply can because if an agent cannot perform an action, he can't be blamed for not acting. But if he can perform an action, he might ought to perform it. But Hare is critical of this idea, and in my view, exceptions to ought implies can be highlighted by restating it as ought always implies can. So on its restatement as ought always implies can, one exception will disprove the rule. And an exception can be found in an agent's point of view in which he does not know if he can or cannot act. And if he does not know that he cannot act, then he ought to try to act. But an objectivist ethics will assume a third-person view rather than the agent's first-person view. And on this view, an agent will know whether he can act or not. But in practice, an agent will not have access to this third-person view. I don't think that the ought implies can question is very interesting, but it does bring us back to a third-person, ostensibly moral neutral point of view. This ostensible moral neutrality of an analytic and linguistic method introduces a new study for us, that is, an exercise in methodology and linguistic philosophy that we haven't yet undertaken in these workshops. Standard courses in philosophy cover basic topics of method, problems of knowledge, and language, but we haven't covered any of these essential topics in these workshops. This is both the strength and weakness of studying one aspect of philosophy. Yet in the wake of universal and or linguistic prescriptivism, we have descriptivism espoused by Philippa Foot. Descriptivism simply regards values and issues of value as empirical facts. But Hare rejected descriptivism, arguing that value judgments are not used to describe properties, but rather to commend action. Yet descriptivism also asks how language is used in everyday life and looks at possible values in language. and certain relations are thought to exist between some words like names and values. We can go on to ask whether values or meanings are supervenient on such terms. That is, do they have contingent or necessary relations with those terms? One kind of relation is the necessary or logical relations that Hare, following Hume, repudiates. Hare writes that there isn't such a logical link between factual premises and moral conclusions. Another kind of relation is a semantic or semiotic one, as a sign indicating something about the terms in question. However, such are empirical and thereby contingent facts which aren't able to justify moral values. In this way, language is able to offer anthropological or psychological material for study, but it isn't able to underpin moral theory as language enthusiasts have supposed. Yet I would like to present language as an aspect of a conceptual framework that is necessary to consciousness. That is, on an externalist theory, an external world of perception is a necessary condition of consciousness. And as previously explained, such theorists hold that a brain alone isn't a sufficient condition. Then, as Hilary Putnam and others have argued, a brain in a vat can't produce consciousness. The point is that language is an aspect of a conceptual apprehension of the world, and it thereby can be seen as having a part to play in producing consciousness and mental state. There is no time to develop this view here, but it shows how a descriptivist view of language can be relevant to the genealogy of consciousness, mental states, and values. So what is the conclusion to our question, does Hare's prescriptivism provide a theory of ethics at all? Prescriptivism is certainly a methodological analysis of moral language and concepts, and in this respect, Hare claims a certain objectivity or neutrality appropriate to that task. Yet modern skeptics would doubt whether such is feasible. By contrast, Hare holds the analytic view that facts and values are distinct and separate. And at the time of writing his works, he says that he can find no credible argument to the contrary. But those arguments have been growing in the form of studies of value-ladenness in social science, as well as in theoretical works, such as Hilary Putnam's entitled The Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy. But the most serious objection to Hare's meta-ethical emphasis on method and the meaning of language is that his emphasis on the prescriptivity, universality, and priority of moral judgments fails to include a succinct idea of the moral good as supplied in value theory ethics. Yet underlying moral values can be seen in prescriptivist moral virtues like fairness, justice, and equality. These are implied in supposedly neutral methodological principles like universalizability. Yet in the comparison made here between prescriptivism and value theory ethics, both allow the material content of moral action to be worked out by the agent. But in this development, Hare's normative principle of universalizability is replaced with the principle of value, and the supposedly prescriptive content of language is replaced with the predilection of value to produce further value, which on both prescriptivism and value theory ethics then needs to be worked out with their respective guidelines. There is also the question of relevance of such theoretical and linguistic theories and their limited practical application. Sometimes theoretical issues are crucial, such as in Hume's is-ought distinction. Understanding such principles can prevent us from wasting our lives on illusions. Yet other studies, possibly in linguistic philosophy, can be highly misleading. So why have we done this study of prescriptivism as a methodological analysis of moral language? The question becomes more urgent in light of my podcast on Wittgenstein and language entitled Has Wittgenstein Done Philosophy More Harm Than Good? And Hare claimed that the achievement of previous theories of ethics was an illusion. Yet we must now ask that question again in light of value theory ethics. Another response is that we have increased our knowledge of language as an expression of value and values. But more tellingly, we can now sideline prescriptivism as an overriding theory of ethics and ask whether it's directly relevant to the question of value as a principle of life. And this is how I proceed in my continuing search to understand what I can do in life. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.